Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. So, what's going on with race riots, protests in the United States has been huge in the news in the last couple of weeks, but also what's going on in Canada. And Councillor in Toronto, Shelley Carroll, has been one of the most vocal advocates of some changes take place. Shelley Carroll is the councillor for Ward 17, Don Valley North. She was first elected in 2000 to the Toronto District School Board, where she served as a trustee for 3 years, including some time as chair of the ward. In 2003, she was elected to City Council, and she's been a councillor for the next 15 years. She's been chair of budget, she's been on the TTC, and she's been on the Toronto Police Services Board. Councillor Shelley Carroll, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You're welcome, Brian.
So tell me, what is the motion that you put forward?
Well, we put forward a motion today that's quite long because so many councillors wanted to have some input. This seems like a moment for the kind of change to the way people are policed in Toronto, and particularly Black and Indigenous Torontonians. And so there are a whole lot of pent-up demands among councillors for things that have to be looked at, things that need to move out of policing, and changes to the actual culture of our police services. And so everyone wanted input. So what we have now is a motion that actually is 17 recommendations long. It looks at a lot of things that the city and the police board and the police services can all work on together. And then attached to it is a long set of recommendations that we've already committed to, that is an action plan called Confronting Anti-Black Racism.
Why has it taken so long for all these recommendations to come to the fore?
Well, we were talking about this earlier today. There have been numerous studies and public inquiries, SIU investigations, all bringing back recommendations. And each time these come forward, there are some red button recommendations within a whole slew, whether it's the Yakabuchi report on persons in crisis had 84 recommendations, the Tulloch directory that had 36 meaningful recommendations. All of these inquiries, they tend to have a whole lot of attention. The most controversial thing gets addressed, and then people tend to move on to the next thing and leave behind what is excellent advice and meaningful change that could be enacted. And so this motion attempts to pick up all of those pieces that we've missed, but that we've already studied, that we know would work, and says, let's do these now. Let's all commit that now is the time to do these things.
Is it because what happened in Minneapolis a month ago has just for some reason created a movement that the political capital is there to get these things passed that maybe in the past you weren't able to?
There's no question. It has created a huge amount of community will. Tragically, we had our own incident in Toronto whose details are not known yet, except that we do know that it was a person in the throes of a mental health crisis who was a Black woman. And the police visited her apartment because she was in distress, and somehow she ended up going over the balcony of her apartment. That's under investigation. We don't know all the circumstances yet, but there is one thing perfectly clear. We go back to 2010 and look at all the losses of life in Toronto, and I can even include some in Peel Region. Most of the losses of life at the hands of police officers have been people of color, either Black or Indigenous, and they have been people in the throes of a mental health crisis. Not criminals and thugs, people in deep mental health crises. And so we know that those two things are converging. Race and mental health response are the two most burning issues within the service. And interestingly enough, those are both things that the police can't solve alone. Perhaps the police shouldn't even be the primary response to the issues being faced in those cases. And so we're now prepared to look at how do we respond to those people? Why is it the police that are being burdened with all of the crises in the mental health system? Could someone else do this job better? If we move that out of policing entirely and over to some new community safety and well-being body, would we get a better result and stop losing lives? Certainly in your city, the same sort of questions are being asked around the loss of life of Ajaz Chowdhury.
Yeah, no question. I interviewed the president of the Canadian Bar Association, and she told me, and I haven't checked the fact, but this is a number that she gave me, was that the percentage of the female population of prisons in Canada was 42% Indigenous, when they make up, less than a couple percentage of the population. Do we have
Exactly.
Do we have systematic racism in Canada against Indigenous people and Black people?
It's time for us to admit that yes, we have. We did a lot of work in this nation over the last century to try and combat it, but the reality is it's there. And the phenomenon that have empowered people who think that they can be openly racist, particularly to Black and Indigenous people, are in some cases global phenomenon. They come from influences outside of government or outside of policing, but they're there. And they're showing up in police response and in incidents that have taken place. And now is the time when the community is saying that they just will not stand for not concretely addressing it now.
We're chatting tonight with Councillor Shelley Carroll, who is the councillor for Don Valley. Don Valley what? Don Valley North?
Don Valley North. It's a new area in the last couple of years.
She's been on City Council Toronto for 15 years. Prior to that, on the Board of Education. We're going to take a break for some messages and have more conversation with Councillor Carroll in just a minute. Stay with us.
Shelley Carroll here.
Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're on Saga 960. We're chatting with Toronto City Councillor for Don Valley North, Shelley Carroll, about what's happening right now with race and policing in the city of Toronto, but frankly, it's happening across North America, if not, frankly, the world. Councillor Carroll, tell me a little bit more in detail, if you could, about these, several, it's more than a dozen recommendations that you've got in this motion that you put forward.
Well, we've sort of divided up to two sides of the ledger. We know that there's a lot of focus on the police, but that doesn't solve the whole problem. And so what we need to do right now is to change the way Black and Indigenous and marginalized people are being policed. And we need to change Black people's lives in Toronto, and I dare say the GTA. And so we have a motion that first of all looks at breaking down some of the resistance to a police service and a police board working together with the city to figure out how to do this. We know that there are some legislative challenges to that at the provincial level that keep us apart, that ensure that there won't be too much political interference in the day-to-days of policing. But that being said, we're not going to solve this problem unless we agree that both sides are going to have to be a little more transparent. We need sharing of data. We need to really look at if we're going to take functions inside the police service and move them over and have them done on the social services side, because that's a better way to deliver them, then we're going to need real data and some real hard looks at the types of responses that are needed to be sure we're making the right move and be sure that we're investing enough on the city side and the social service side to make sure that it's an adequate replacement and that the response will still be there. And we're talking about things like mental health response, but there are a whole host of others. There are a lot of things around child welfare where we have a police officer accompany the various agencies, Children's Aid and such, because we think that's what it takes. There are a whole lot of things that hope to, for young people, avoid the justice system entirely. So where they may have been in an encounter with police, the choice is pre-charge before we send you down that path that may criminalize you. Instead, we're going to put you through a form of a social work process whereby you're going to be counseled and go through a family therapy session, and we're going to put you back out into your community ready to be on the best path. Does a police officer have to do that, or should he or she be doing the hardcore crime fighting? Well, the social side can be picked up by people who are more specifically better trained and got into their careers to do exactly those types of actions. Most police officers didn't know that those are the actions that would make up so much of their day when they went to police college.
Yeah, I can imagine. So can you teach people to be not racist?
Well, you can teach people to understand their ability to oppress, and it starts right there. You and I can learn that when we're not really conscious about it, it's far too easy to oppress and to flaunt your entitlement. It starts right there, and it's little things. It's not even just changing these functions. Police just being on the scene, depending where they are, can be kind of an oppressive feeling, can make people feel bad about where they are. We live in a have-not neighborhood. We're disadvantaged, but we're working hard to be a part of the rest of the community where more affluent neighbors live. Does a police car need to be parked in front of our housing complex at all times? Doesn't that send the wrong message about us? Little things like that can oppress peoples. And police officers that have the best of intentions and are the best at their job need to be trained that they need to be mindful of those things and change that impact. That's just the start of it. That goes beyond the more blatant examples where you have an officer who isn't the best at his job and maybe got into it with a built-in bias.
What about mental health? You talked about that a lot of the problems with people that were killed in the line of duty by police were mental health patients, not even anyone else. What's the right solution to mental health issues?
Well, people have been saying for a long time, I can go back as far as 1988. Imagine that. That was the first time former Mayor John Sewell came out and really got involved in looking at police accountability after the death of a man named Lester Donaldson, Black man in Toronto, in a mental crisis, who was gunned down by police. And he started asking then, do they give the right response? Shouldn't there be a special team that deals with that emotionally disturbed person that's probably at the worst moment in their life and none of us knows why? That model has been invented now. We have it in our police service. You have it in yours. Hamilton has it, called mental crisis intervention teams, where you have a mental health trained nurse from the community hospital in a range and a police officer who's had over and above special training in mental health response. And they're stationed throughout the day to take those types of calls. But what we have right now is a police procedure that says, first, a primary response unit, a squad car with 2 officers in it, armed officers, will attend that call. And when they decide it's safe, then we'll bring in that mental health crisis intervention team. As long ago as 2014, Justice Frank Iacobucci, after an exhaustive study of 3 very tragic cases in Toronto Police Service incidents, came forward and he said, why are they not the first responders? He did a study globally and discovered that there are cities where that mental crisis intervention team is allowed to go to the site first, maybe with other officers, but they're there to bring a mental health approach right off the bat. And I'll give you an example of how that would change. In the death of a man named Andrew Loku in the city of Toronto, just after the Iacobucci report, his recommendation that they be first responders wasn't heeded. And so in an apartment building designated for mental health association clients, it's special housing for them. So officers would have known they were responding to some sort of crisis like that. They entered and found a man who was upset about noise in an apartment, and he had taken a hammer with him to upstairs to say, I mean business, I can't take this noise anymore. A man in deep mental health crisis, and there's lots of documentation of how his life led him to be that way. But there he was at the end of the hall when the police arrived. And they, for 20 seconds, screamed nothing but the same command over and over again. Drop your weapon, drop your weapon, drop your weapon, drop your weapon, drop your weapon. And then when he took steps toward them, they shot him. That's not a mental health response. That's not de-escalation. And any mental health professional will tell you that. If they responded to the call knowing his name, or even if they didn't, wait, stay there. What's in your hand? What's your name? Andrew? Andrew, what's in your hand? What are you holding? Can you hold it down so I can see it? Can you put it down for a minute? Can we talk about this? Andrew, stop moving. Can we talk? Let's talk, Andrew. So did you get that name out of him? That's what the mental health officers and nurses are trained to do. That's true de-escalation. We're just talking, look at me, I'm not moving. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to stay here. You stay there. Let's just give me a minute. Okay, they turned off their stereo now. Let's talk about this. You need me to talk to her for you? Would you like me to tell them they can't make noise anymore? Andrew, just talk to me. Have I spent more than 20 seconds now, Brian?
Yeah, no question. But also what you're describing.
And Andrew's still alive, and that's the point.
But what you're describing is not what I'd expect from a police officer. And so you're probably right that that's not what a police officer is trained to do. That said, we've heard a lot in the news in the last little while about that police officers are trained to de-escalate. And we've seen a lot of examples, frankly, where they have not de-escalated, and some good examples of where they have de-escalated tensions at protests and things like that.
There is no question. They have that training, and I've witnessed it. I went to see how they are trained and stayed in Toronto. They take a 3-day training session every year. I went and signed up and took the whole training for 3 days. The only thing I didn't do was the target practice at the end. So I watched them take de-escalation training, and they do execute it. There are lots of times where they execute it. And that's why I hope when we sit down with them to talk about the things we can change, the functions that you are probably spending too much time in when there are other professionals that can do it, I hope they understand that there are lots of people in cities who are grateful for every success they have and are thankful that they're there. But the fact remains, there is a sizable portion of this community, and so often they are persons of color who are having an entirely different experience with police in their lives than I'm having. And that's not acceptable anymore for me as a white person. I don't want to go to bed comforted that I get the better treatment. I want to go to bed knowing we're all getting that same treatment.
Well, I've done a couple of panel shows in the last couple of weeks on this issue, and I've been shocked, frankly, and moved by some people. I had one couple, upper middle class couple from Oakville, driving both African Canadians, blacks, and driving nice cars. They tell me that on average, once a month, they'll get stopped because they shouldn't be driving such a car in a nice neighborhood in Oakville. And a Wall Street banker, a very successful Harvard Business School graduate Wall Street banker, lives in New Jersey, who told me that he's subjected to racism every day.
Oh, there's no question about that. There's no question about that. I've witnessed it. I've experienced it. My grandchildren are Black. And you forget how entitled you are. I was letting my grandson and his friend jump out of the car, and you guys run in and get some Gatorade before the practice. I'll stay in the car. Here's my card. Run in there and just tap it and get some Gatorade for the guys. Get 6 bottles. And I turned around and I looked through the window as they went into the store, and I realized, judging from the way that man is looking, there's no way he's letting them use that card. I realized I don't have that option with this child. I have to go in there. He's not going to be able to do what would be so easy to do with any other child if they were white. That's pervasive throughout our community. And probably that store owner, if you called him on it, he would be mortified that he was showing his racism so overtly. He probably thought he was hiding it pretty well, but I could see it. And I knew what was going to happen by the way he was following their every move. And so, that happens every day. I can remember when they were babies sitting in a McDonald's, someone came over and patted me on the head and said, "You're doing a great job. And I don't care what anyone says, you're doing the right thing." And I just said, "Oh, thank you." It took me a long time because I've lived a very entitled life to realize, oh, that was racism. What does she mean you're doing the right thing? I think she thinks I'm raising the children of my daughter who's a drug addict or something. She made a whole set of assumptions that I've never experienced until I found myself in this fusion family. And once you become aware that that is daily in people's lives, you can't turn away from it anymore.
I think more of us need to hear those kinds of stories so that we realize what occurs.
Yeah.
We're chatting tonight with Councillor Shelley Carroll from Don Valley North in the City of Toronto. Stay with us. We're going to take a couple of message breaks and be right back. Stay with us.
Shelley Carroll.
Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. We're chatting tonight with City Councillor from Don Valley North in the City of Toronto, Councillor Shelley Carroll. She's been on City Council for 15 years. She's on the Toronto Police Services Board. She's on the TTC, and her and some of her fellow councillors have recently come out with a motion with, I think that you said 15 different items that needs to be changed. Councillor Carroll, you're on the Toronto Police Services Board. You know, and I'm not saying this in regards to Toronto, I'm just saying this generally in regards to watching the news and listening to the news. I've heard chiefs of police and heads of police services board or commissioners of police and union leaders, presidents of unions for police with the same city and three completely different attitudes. Is the governance of police forces messed up somehow?
Well, I think they're facing challenges, particularly in the last 20 years or so. They're facing challenges that, for whatever reason, we've chosen not to face together. And so there's been, in Toronto, and I think it happens in other places, there's been some turmoil going on around how cities are managed. We went through our amalgamation, and we're pretty much, focused inward and focused on that. Police boards, though, do some of the most important work to do with cities, in that cities fund and provide some oversight for police services. But because it's over there at headquarters, we don't notice that an inequity, a controversy, a power struggle, that these things are brewing over there. Communities are going to speak to it, and we're not witness to it. We stay over here at City Hall, and it might show up on the GTA page in the newspaper the next day, but we think, oh, that's not my file. Once you get on the police board, you realize that it's the most important file, that some of the most important impacts on people's lives are happening in your police headquarters at your board meetings. And so there's been a real struggle over there where all of us should have been paying attention to who is our chief. How are we gonna open the dialogue with the community of what is a good police chief, and how will the selection take place? Only board members will take part in it, but rather than just sort of nibble away at it, have we got the right process? Sure, policing is governed by a provincial piece of legislation, the Police Act, but you can put the city's brand on it. How accountable are we for the power struggles there? If the chief and the chair and the president of the union are always at odds, it's an emergency that we solve that. And quite frankly, the day that I first joined the police board and Mayor John Tory joined the police board, that was entirely the case. Post G20 crisis, the relationship between the three was completely broken down. And if you don't get involved in it as a city governance organization and manage those relationships, they manage themselves in ways that aren't healthy. They begin to, between the three parties, they start to look at, if I band together with him, I'll have more power and I can have influence over him. And, they start playing a sort of three-person game of chess, and that's all about who's got the power, who's going to decide whether we're doing anything differently or not, and how can I block this, how can I block that. That's not how we're going to get to the point where we can all be proud in our community of how very much any resident can trust our police service. That ought to be everyone's goal.
In numerous
And
cities in the
we don't
United
pay attention. That is no longer the goal.
In numerous cities in the United States, there's been calls to defund police, and I presume that's to put funding into other areas like social services, as you've been mentioning. Do you think that's the right strategy in Toronto?
Well, it means different things to different people, and that's a problem in a movement that has sprung up like this. Um, while it was born in the United States, and it's important there because there are places in the United States where as much as a third of the budget is going to policing, and there's almost nothing left of their social services safety net. And we have been shortchanging our social services, both at the city side and I dare say provincially. Would more kids have a good start if we had a decent childcare strategy anywhere in the GTA? Absolutely. So things like that have been sort of given short shrift, especially with concerns to the opportunities that should be within those systems for Black Torontonians. We have not invested enough. And so on the police side, while it hasn't gone through the roof in its budget totals, it's well above and beyond what we've been willing to pay for those social services. But you get to a point where even the police themselves, our chief right now, our outgoing chief, Mark Saunders, is fond of saying when people come to him and say, "You're having a gang war this summer, Chief Saunders. Why are all these men killing each other?" And he means social services when he says, this is not a problem you can arrest your way out of. We need to see investments, not just in our budget, but elsewhere. You need to make sure that you're investing in these people's lives, not just the officers that police them. He's been saying that. And so I don't think the police are the enemy here, but a real cooperative look together, a collaborative look that now says, let's take some of the functions you do and the funding provided for that and move them over here. You will see a decrease in a police budget then. But the more important thing is that you will see a complete change in certain responses and cultures within policing and serving Torontonians who are Black, who are Indigenous, and marginalized people of all types.
The attention has been primarily on the police because of what's happened, I think, in the United States, but also you point out Canada. But it's not just a police problem, isn't it? A wider problem. I've interviewed a couple of people who have identified how Crown prosecutors will load up charges against Black people, not be interested in settlements and negotiations, and make it very difficult for them to manage through the legal system, where things are stacked up against them and they're just seen wrong by the legal system. And then I've interviewed people that say, the best education they got in gang warfare was going to prison. And so therefore, when you end up having prisons that are heavily populated by these people that get arrested that you mentioned just a minute ago, they end up getting educated in exactly what we don't want them to be educated. And I interviewed one young lady who turned herself around, but she was kicked out of something over a dozen schools, got a terrible education, was dealt with incredibly poorly by our educational system and our social services system. But then she got into prison and she said, I got a great education, but the education was from my other prisoners and it was on how to rob, how to steal, how to be a gang member, etc. Don't we have a problem with everything in our justice system, policing, the court system, and our prisons? And how do we solve that?
Absolutely. And you're right in that it starts that young, because it actually starts in our school systems. Students are sometimes subconsciously, sometimes consciously, are judged differently. There are expectations for one set of students that aren't there for the others. And so they're really set up to not to succeed right from the very beginning. When I was a school board trustee and we did expulsion hearings, I did a lot of them because I did the job as a full-timer. I didn't have a day job, and so I was available for hearings. Likewise, my colleague on the board at the time was Kathleen Wynn. We did a lot of hearings. We almost never did a hearing for a child who was white. Does that mean that white kids don't get up to funny business? I was naughty when I was a child in school. So were you probably. But the kids who were given consequence after consequence, suspension after suspension, suspensions just don't work. Why would you remove a child from the system that you need more than anyone else to succeed? And certainly, why would you expel him? What do people say? Oh, these kids are lazy. They don't even bother to finish high school. Well, we set them up not to finish high school. And then they find themselves in the justice system. The justice system is a network of prosecutors and defenders who specialize in taking care of them. And sometimes even their own defense lawyers have low expectations for, yeah, I'll get you off this charge, but we're not going to have a conversation about how you turn your life around now because you are my constant source of income. This is my specialty. And so even his own defense attorney, it doesn't have a stake in him succeeding or her. And so they swirl around the justice system. The problem is exacerbated in the United States by the private sector industrial prison complex. But we have shades of that here as well. We say, oh, we haven't privatized to the extent that they have. But what we do is within our public models, we privatize components as much as we can. And each of those private components needs to make a profit. And they profit from people not succeeding and staying in the justice system, swirling around in it, generating revenue for everyone from the lawyer to the judge to the prisons themselves. And so we have to determine that we're going to change that, holus bolus. That's why what was important for us in our motion, that it's not just a policing motion. It's a motion that looks at confronting anti-Black racism with an action plan that builds opportunities for that community. Is that special treatment? Are they getting a special investment? Yes, because they need it. And if they succeed, we all have a more successful community and can enjoy a wonderful life. Bring those people more fully into the economy, and we all benefit from the better economy.
You raised education, and I don't want you to, I don't want to ask you about Peel Board of Education, which has had significant problems because you're probably not aware of it. But when you were on the Toronto Board of Education, did you find racism? You talk about these hearings that you were at, being only non-white people. Do you think there's racism in education like there in Toronto, like there is in Peel, or would appear there is in Peel?
It does appear. I am somewhat aware of it. And what we call it is, you hear people talking about institutional racism. There's bias within it. And so bias develops over time. And sometimes you find yourself exhibiting a bias and you haven't even noticed it. Oh, that kid's tall and he's Black. He's going to be a basketball player. So he's good in math, but do I really want to stop right now and give him hell for not completing his homework? He's not going to grow up to be an accountant. He's not going to Bay Street. So I'm going to move on to the next kid right now. There, teacher, you just, whether you did that really consciously or you just made a very quick decision and moved on to the next desk, you just started the process of having lower expectations for that young man. And so it's why you see in Toronto, the board is taking a next step. Long ago, they started a Black focused curriculum at the high school level. Then you saw an elementary school, and these are schools that have not been without their challenges, like any other high school, like any other elementary school in a challenging neighborhood. They've had their problems, but by and large, there's a dedication in those facilities that many parents have taken advantage of to go into a curriculum that, first of all, is designed so the kids see themselves in the curriculum, right down to every last math problem, and also designed to constantly train and refresh the training and the recognition of what is oppression and what is bias, so that fundamentally that faculty of that school and the Center for Excellence they're now developing is fully focused on eradicating that kind of subtle institutional bias from the experience those kids in that school are going to have. It was very controversial for the TDSB to embark upon that, but very, very necessary.
We're chatting with Councillor Shelley Carroll, Councillor for Don Valley North in the City of Toronto Council. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments. Stay with us. Well, what a fascinating conversation with Councillor Shelley Carroll, who is the Councillor for Don Valley North in the City of Toronto Council. I've followed her career with interest over the years, and what an interesting portfolio she has right now on the TTC and the challenges that they must be having as they don't get the revenue because of COVID-19 and have got to be thinking about how they are impacted by sort of the reopening and passengers and lower ridership and revenue, and then the Police Services Board and what's happening with racism and anti-racism across North America today. Shelley, Councillor Carroll, I spoke with someone the other day who said this is like a moment in history, comparable to the Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein. And for whatever reason, there's been, problems that females have had with assault and sexual assault and abuse for generations. But for some reason with Harvey Weinstein, it came to a head and there was opportunity to make real change. And it appeared to happen. And they said, this is a comparable kind of opportunity. There has been racism for, a couple hundred years in the United States and whatever in Canada. And this is an opportunity for real change. What's your political assessment?
Well, you know what? That's a very good analogy. And I hope that's the result, because there is no question that in that movement, the Me Too movement, it was about certain cases and certain, the worst of the perpetrators, but it did make lasting change. Things are different in the workplace. People do understand they have to behave differently, and hopefully it lasts. It's been a couple of years now. And I can't help but think that it was because that movement was so widespread, and it wasn't one person's movement. We made that mistake in the women's movement at times back in the 70s, where it was about a certain person. It was about Gloria Steinem. It's about Bella Abzug, those types of things. The Me Too movement was about every woman and about making change, and that's all it was about. If in the defund movement, if in the anti-Black racism movement that is out there, if we can keep it about the change that needs to happen, and not about any one person, and not about any one component. If we don't get this, we've lost it all. If it's really about changing the lives of Black people here in Toronto and the GTA, but throughout North America and the globe, if it's really about that and we stay focused on that, then while there are different opinions within this movement and different responses to it in governments, we could all stay on the same side, and we could look back a year from now, a couple of years from now, and say, we are changing this. It is finally back on track. It is unacceptable to exhibit anti-Black racism. It is unacceptable to exhibit racism in all its forms, and we see it changing. That's got to be the goal. That's why the Me Too movement has been successful in actually changing the way men understand it's acceptable to behave. And that was an amazing change to happen. Sure, there are men that still have chauvinistic tendencies, but they know that they're the ones who are taboo now. They're not empowered to exhibit that overtly. And that happened amazingly quickly. We could have the same rapid change here if we stay focused and make it about making that change and not about any one person leading it or being in charge of it.
So how do you do that? How do you keep it going? Is your motion the way to keep it going?
Well, it's one of the ways. Really, it's all eyes on governments right now. If we all get in that boat and start rowing, and really continuing to not just move a motion and say, there, I made a motion that sounds good, but actually make these actions come true in record time, that will be enough of a statement, not just to the movement, but to the people sitting at home saying, I don't agree with them. No, guess what? Governments heard them, and governments think they're right. We have to stop exhibiting anti-Black racism. So if you're sitting at home thinking that this will all blow over and that you can continue to hang on to racial biases, no, you better find a way to hide them under a rock, because they're no longer acceptable. And governments are acting on that and investing to eradicate it.
Councillor Shelley Carroll from Don Valley North, thank you so much for joining us tonight on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've got two things that are really impacting us, maybe more. We've got COVID-19, a global pandemic. Yeah. We've got this racism that has come to the fore and been very exhibited in our TVs night after night. We've got an economic calamity that we're suffering through, both from a personal standpoint, but undoubtedly from a governmental standpoint as well. And I think a lot of people are dealing with mental health issues. We're talking about potential boon and divorces, and people that are just going stir crazy and got to get out. What do you have as a final message to the listeners tonight in this time of, craziness, frankly?
Well, there have been some, if we think about it, I don't think this is a moment of craziness. This may be a moment of clarity. If we think about it, maybe the reason we are so focused on caring about those who are not doing so well and caring about those who are facing this injustice because of COVID-19. There have been terrible losses. Families have lost people to COVID-19, and it's very troubling. But people have got the time in their lives now, because we're all sort of functioning at a lower speed and locked down. We've had a moment of clarity. So we're not rushing through our work lives and, a person died last night at the hands of police. I feel bad about that. And I'll feel bad about it until I get in the car and start my way down to work. And then I'll just think about traffic. That distraction isn't there right now. And so in a moment of clarity, people are prepared to mobilize around solving some of the world's ills that weren't there before. They didn't have the time. And now that they've awoken to them, what we hope is that as we move forward into a really challenging economy, I think COVID will affect our economy for a long time to come. But as we move forward into that, I hope that people will hang on to that real awareness that they felt while they had time to feel it. As I improve this economy, it can't just be about me. Will I recoup whatever I used to earn? What's the point of that if I'm not making sure that all the people who lost everything due to the lockdown aren't coming along with us? We won't achieve the economic highs that we had before unless we are prepared to pick them up and bring them with us.
There's that line, I can't remember it exactly, but when a tide goes out, it exposes all the boats. I think that what COVID-19 has done is exposed a lot of the faults within our society, whether they be the treatment of Blacks, people of lower socioeconomic status that have ended up suffering a lot more of the infections and of the disease, how critically important essential workers are, truckers, grocers, long-term healthcare. One of the biggest tragedies in this whole situation has been long-term care and how many deaths that have occurred there. And there's something wrong that's going on there. And our public health system. And so I think that COVID-19 has been sort of a crucible that has exposed a lot of the faults within our families, and also within our societies. Anyway, Councillor Shelley Carroll, thank you so much for your time today and joining us. I really appreciate it. You're welcome back on our show anytime you want.
Anytime you need me, Brian.
Thank you very much. That's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're on every day, Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on Saga 960 AM, or you can stream us online at www.saga960am.ca. You can get all my podcasts and video casts on my website, briancrombie.com. Thanks for joining us. Good night.